Tonight we descend into something utterly terrifying, magnificently cruel, and absolutely lethal. My life under Caligula's Rome, not as a senator, not as a praetorian guard, no imperial protection, no marble safety. Tonight you're not Caesar Augustus, you're just you, dropped defenseless into a world where the emperor declares himself a living god, executes people for sport, and where your morning breath might be considered treason. You open your eyes on what could very well be your last day alive. It's the year 40 CE. Before we continue deeper into these ancient shadows, take a quiet moment to subscribe if these forgotten stories bring you peace. And if you're still drifting with us, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world as we wander through history's quieter moments. 3 years into the reign of Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, though whisper his childhood nickname, Caligula, and you might find yourself crucified by sunset. The emperor who once charmed Rome with gladiatorial games and tax abolitions has transformed into something far more sinister. A paranoid deity who sees enemies in shadows and entertainment in screams. This isn't the Rome of careful politics and senatorial dignity. This is the Rome where the emperor's horse Incitatus lives better than most citizens, where declaring war on Neptune himself seemed like reasonable foreign policy, and where the wrong glance at the wrong moment could see you dragged to the palace dungeons for interrogation by men who've perfected the art of keeping you conscious while they work. You're about to experience 24 hours in a city where death walks openly through the forum, where the emperor might order mass executions because he's bored, and where survival depends not on your skills or strength, but on remaining utterly, completely invisible to a madman who believes he's Jupiter incarnate. Welcome to Caligula's Rome, where every breath you take is stolen from the grave, and every heartbeat brings you closer to discovering why historians would later call these the most terrifying years in Roman history. You've awakened in a world where the emperor has declared himself above mortal law, where he's bankrupted the treasury on floating palaces and golden statues of himself, and where the Praetorian guards, your supposed protectors, might be the very ones to drag you away for the emperor's amusement. The air itself feels different here, thicker, charged with the kind of tension that comes when an entire empire holds its breath, waiting to see who will be next. Citizens scurry through streets with downcast eyes, senators practice speeches they'll never dare give, and even the bravest centurions check over their shoulders before speaking above a whisper. This morning, you'll witness things that will haunt your dreams, if you survive to have dreams again. You'll see how quickly popularity can turn to paranoia, how absolute power doesn't just corrupt but transforms its wielder into something inhuman. You'll understand why grown men weep at the mention of the imperial palace, why mothers pray their sons never catch the emperor's attention, and why the smartest Romans have already fled to the farthest provinces, hoping distance might save them from Caligula's reach. But there's no escape for you, no exile to Gaul, no retreat to a country villa. You're here, in the beating heart of an empire ruled by a man who believes himself divine, who sees human life as expendable entertainment, and who has surrounded himself with sycophants too terrified to tell him when he's wrong, which is every waking moment. The sun rises blood-red over the 7 hills, casting long shadows that seem to reach toward you like grasping fingers. Somewhere in the distance you can hear the first screams of the day, perhaps a neighbor who spoke too freely at last night's dinner, perhaps a merchant who failed to bow deeply enough when the imperial litter passed, perhaps someone whose only crime was being in the wrong place when the emperor's mood shifted like mercury. You'll learn today that in Caligula's Rome, logic has been crucified, Reason has been fed to the lions, and sanity itself has been declared an enemy of the state. The emperor who once promised to restore the glory of Augustus has instead created a nightmare where yesterday's heroes become today's corpses, where loyalty is rewarded with suspicion, and where the only predictable thing about imperial favor is how quickly it can turn to imperial wrath. This is your introduction to life under a ruler who makes Nero look restrained, who makes Commodus seem rational, and who has transformed the eternal city into a stage for his own twisted theatrical productions, where the audience never knows if they're spectators or the next act. The forum bells are ringing, calling citizens to another day of pretending everything is normal while their emperor plays God with real consequences. The shops are opening, the slaves are stirring, and somewhere in his golden palace, Caligula is waking up to plan new torments for a populace that once cheered his name, and now whispers prayers that he might simply ignore them. Your survival depends on understanding one crucial fact. You are now living in the fever dream of a megalomaniac who controls the most powerful military force on earth, who believes himself to be divine, and who has already demonstrated that human life means less to him than the entertainment value of watching it end. So take a deep breath of Roman air. It might be your last free one. Check that your sandals are secure, that your tunic bears no suspicious stains, and that your face shows nothing but bland, forgettable pleasantness. Today you'll discover what it truly means to live under tyranny. Not the distant political kind described in scrolls, but the immediate personal kind that could knock on your door at any moment with steel in its hands and madness in its eyes. The day is beginning in Caligula's Rome. May the gods, all of them, including the new one who wears a purple toga and sits on the Palatine Hill, have mercy on your soul. You wake to the sound of sobbing, not the gentle weeping of grief, but the raw, desperate wailing of someone who knows they'll never see another dawn. It's coming from the apartment below yours in this crumbling insula, where Lucius Quintus lived until yesterday when imperial guards dragged him away for allegedly comparing the emperor's new golden statue to a melted candle. His wife Claudia now mourns alone, knowing that any public display of grief for a condemned man might be seen as criticism of imperial justice. Your living quarters in this fifth-floor death trap have become even more precarious under Caligula's reign. The emperor's massive construction projects, his floating palaces, his bridge across the Bay of Naples, his plan to carve a new harbour at Rhegium, have drained the treasury and driven up the cost of everything. Rent has tripled since he took power, not because landlords are greedy, but because they're desperately trying to pay the crushing new taxes imposed to fund the emperor's delusions of grandeur. The walls around you are thinner than parchment, and every whispered conversation is a potential death sentence. Your neighbor Marcus was executed last month because someone overheard him mention that the emperor's latest speech sounded confused. The informant received a small bag of silver. Marcus received a sword through the throat. Now everyone speaks in euphemisms, codes and carefully modulated whispers that could still mean death if misinterpreted. There's no furniture in your room anymore. You sold it all to pay the emergency levies imposed when Caligula decided he needed a new temple to himself on the Palatine Hill. The wooden chair went to cover the divine emperor tax. The table paid for the sacred construction tribute, and your sleeping mat was traded for enough grain to last 3 days, when the emperor temporarily banned grain imports because the Egyptian merchants failed to properly worship his statue. Your single window, barely larger than your fist, offers a view of the apartment building across the narrow alley, where 3 families have already disappeared this month. First, the baker's family vanished after their son was caught. Drawing in the dirt, imperial spies decided his scratches resembled a crude caricature of the emperor. Then the weaver's household was arrested, because their loom made rhythmic sounds that someone interpreted as mocking the emperor's stutter. Most recently, the elderly couple on the third floor were taken because their grandson visited from Gaul and was overheard speaking in Gallic, which was deemed suspicious foreign plotting. The floorboards beneath your feet sag ominously, weakened by the constant dampness that no one dares fix. Maintenance workers have become scarce since Caligula ordered the execution of a crew who accidentally damaged a small shrine while repairing a roof. Now, any work that might accidentally disturb something sacred, and everything has become sacred since the emperor declared himself divine, is considered potential sacrilege punishable by crucifixion. Your chamber pot sits in the corner, but emptying it has become a calculated risk. The communal waste area downstairs is monitored by Gaius Flavius, a former gladiator turned imperial informant who watches for any behavior he can report as suspicious. Last week he claimed that Tertius the scribe was disposing of evidence because he emptied his pot at an unusual hour. Tertius was found floating in the Tiber 2 days later, his body bearing the distinctive marks of professional interrogation. The air inside your room is stifling, thick with the smell of fear and unwashed bodies. No one opens windows anymore because doing so might allow conversations to drift outside, where they could be overheard by the growing network of imperial spies. Children have been recruited as informants with promises of sweets and small coins. Slaves report on their masters, wives on their husbands, sons on their fathers, all hoping that demonstrating loyalty to the divine emperor might protect them from his increasingly erratic wrath. Your few remaining possessions are carefully arranged to show no hint of wealth or comfort that might attract attention. The emperor has been known to confiscate property on whims. Last month he declared that anyone owning more than 2 tunics was clearly hoarding resources that belonged to the state. Citizens now deliberately dress in rags, hoping poverty might render them invisible to imperial attention. The building's stairs creak with a different sound now, the cautious, measured steps of people who know that walking too loudly might be interpreted as arrogance, while walking too softly might suggest sneaking. 3 flights down, old Cassia sits by her door all day, pretending to spin wool while actually listening for any conversations that might be worth reporting. She turned in her own nephew last month when he mentioned that bread prices were becoming impossible to afford, apparently criticizing imperial economic policy. Through the thin walls you can hear the family next door practicing their morning prayers to the emperor's divine essence. This ritual has become mandatory in all residential buildings, and failure to participate enthusiastically enough has resulted in multiple disappearances. The prayers must be loud enough to prove sincerity, but not so loud as to suggest mockery. The timing must be precise. Too early suggests impatience with imperial schedules, too late suggests defiance of imperial authority. Water drips steadily from the ceiling above your sleeping area, but repairing it would require reporting the problem to building authorities, which would mean official attention, which would mean scrutiny of your identity, your activities, your associations, and your loyalty. Better to sleep in dampness than risk the questions that might follow a maintenance request. The morning light filtering through your tiny window reveals scratch marks on the walls where previous tenants carved desperate prayers, farewell messages, and occasionally very faintly criticisms of the emperor that they were too terrified to speak aloud. You've learned not to look too closely at these markings. Reading them might be considered evidence of seditious thoughts, and seditious thoughts under Caligula are treated the same as seditious actions. This is your shelter, your refuge, your trap in a city where the emperor's paranoia has transformed every private space into a potential crime scene. Your bladder is full, but relief has become a life-threatening gamble. The communal latrina at the end of your street now operates under new imperial regulations established after Caligula declared that even waste disposal must reflect proper reverence for his divine status. A bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance reads, "By order of the Divine Emperor, all bodily functions must be conducted in accordance with sacred protocol." The latrina itself has been transformed from a simple public convenience into a surveillance nightmare. Sextus Brutus, a former wine merchant turned imperial hygiene inspector, now sits at a small wooden table recording the names, times and duration of every visitor. His ledger, he proudly announces, goes directly to the Palatine Hill, where the Divine Emperor personally reviews it for signs of suspicious patterns. Too frequent visits suggest anxiety about something, possibly guilt. Too infrequent visits suggest deliberate avoidance of imperial oversight. Either pattern could result in interrogation. You approach cautiously, keeping your eyes downcast as you join the queue. The man ahead of you, Flavius the baker, whispers nervously to himself, prayers to the emperor's divine essence mixed with apologies for bodily functions he cannot control. Behind you, a young mother clutches her son's hand while teaching him the proper phrases he must recite before, during, and after his business. "Blessed be the divine emperor who permits my humble relief," the child practices in a trembling voice. The communal sponges have been replaced with individual reeds that citizens must bring themselves, as sharing cleaning implements was deemed too intimate for the divine era. However, bringing your own reed suggests premeditation, which implies you planned your bodily functions without consulting imperial scheduling. Not bringing a reed suggests disrespect for cleanliness in the divine presence. 3 people were executed last week for inappropriate hygiene planning. Inside the latrina, the stone bench has been modified with small bronze plaques above each hole, each bearing Caligula's image. Citizens must maintain eye contact with these imperial portraits while conducting their business, as looking away might suggest shame about natural functions occurring in the divine presence. However, staring too intently at the emperor's image while in such a vulnerable position could be interpreted as mockery or inappropriate intimacy with the divine visage. The waste trough beneath flows more slowly now because the aqueduct workers are afraid to perform maintenance. After Caligula executed an engineer for suggesting that water flow improvements would enhance the imperial city's glory, apparently implying that current imperial infrastructure was inadequate. No one dares propose modifications to any system the emperor might consider a reflection of his divine engineering. Wisdom. Privacy has become a memory. The wooden partitions between seats were removed by imperial decree after someone carved Caligula is mad into the oak. Now every patron sits exposed to the scrutiny of their neighbors, each watching for any expression, gesture, or sound that might be worth reporting. Facial expressions during relief must show gratitude for the emperor's gracious provision of public facilities, but not too much pleasure, as enjoying bodily functions excessively was recently classified as un-Roman decadence. The communal washing basin presents its own dangers. The water, supplied by buckets from the nearest fountain, must be approached with ritualized respect. Each user must first pour a small amount on the ground as an offering to the emperor's divine wisdom in providing water to his subjects. However, wasting water by pouring too much suggests disregard for imperial resources. Pouring too little suggests insufficient gratitude for divine provision. Conversation in the latrina has become a deadly minefield. Traditional Roman toilet humor could now be interpreted as irreverence toward bodily functions that occur in spaces blessed by imperial oversight. Discussing personal health issues might suggest criticism of imperial living conditions. Mentioning digestive problems could imply that imperial food policies are inadequate. Even commenting on the weather might be twisted into criticism of the emperor's divine influence over natural phenomena. The attendant Sextus watches everything with the dedication of a zealot. He records not just names and times, but also expressions, utterances, and what he calls suspicious elimination patterns. His reports have already led to 12 arrests this month. Marcus Aurelius, not the future emperor, just an unfortunate citizen with an imperial name, was dragged away for excessive grunting, which was interpreted as mocking the emperor's alleged digestive troubles. A young woman named Livia disappeared after she sighed with relief, which Sextus reported as inappropriate pleasure in activities conducted under divine oversight. The bronze mirrors mounted on the walls are polished to perfection, ostensibly to allow citizens to ensure their appearance remains respectful in the divine presence. In reality, they provide perfect viewing angles for observing every patron from multiple perspectives. Citizens have learned to control not just their words and obvious actions, but every facial expression, every gesture, every involuntary reaction that might betray thoughts deemed inappropriate for the sacred space. Leaving the latrina requires its own ritual. You must bow to each imperial portrait, recite the prescribed gratitude formula, and walk backward for the first 10 steps to avoid turning your back on the divine images. Moving too quickly suggests eagerness to escape imperial presence. Moving too slowly suggests reluctance to return to productive work in service of the empire. The prescribed pace must be maintained precisely, and Sextus has a sand timer to ensure compliance. The fear extends beyond the latrina itself. Citizens now suffer from what physicians privately call imperial bladder, the inability to relax enough for normal bodily functions due to constant anxiety about surveillance and potential punishment. Many hold their relief for dangerous lengths of time, preferring physical discomfort to the risks of public facilities. Others have developed elaborate private arrangements, despite the legal prohibition against unauthorized waste disposal, because even basic human dignity has become a capital offense. This simple biological necessity, once taken for granted, has become a daily trial, where survival depends on performing natural functions according to unnatural rules, where even the most private moments of human vulnerability have been weaponized by a paranoid emperor who sees treason in every action and divine significance in every imperial regulation. Your stomach gnaws at itself with the desperate hunger that has become Rome's new constant companion, but finding food in Caligula's empire means navigating a minefield of imperial whims that change faster than the weather. The emperor's extravagant spending on floating palaces and golden statues has bankrupted the treasury, leading to food shortages that he blames on everything except his own fiscal madness. Last week he declared that the grain shortage was caused by Neptune's jealousy of his divine status. The week before, he blamed it on senators secretly hoarding bread to make him look incompetent. The morning bread line stretches around 3 city blocks, a serpentine queue of hollow-eyed citizens clutching clay tokens and copper coins, praying the supply won't run out before their turn. But joining this line means officially registering your presence with Quintus Maximus, the imperial food distribution overseer, who records every citizen's food acquisition patterns. Too much bread suggests gluttony inappropriate for the lean times imposed by divine will. Too little suggests suspicious frugality. Perhaps you have hidden food stores obtained through treasonous black market activities. At the front of the line, you can see Marcus Tullius being questioned by 2 Praetorian guards. His crime? Yesterday he asked for an extra portion, claiming his pregnant wife needed additional nutrition. The guards are now investigating whether this request constituted criticism of imperial food policy, since it implied that standard rations were inadequate for citizens' needs. His wife stands nearby, her hands protectively covering her swollen belly, tears streaming down her face as she realizes her husband's thoughtfulness might cost him his life. The bread itself, when you finally receive your carefully measured portion, bears the texture and flavor of desperation. Wheat has become scarce since Caligula diverted most grain shipments to feed the thousands of exotic animals he's imported for increasingly elaborate gladiatorial spectacles. The bakers now stretch their flour with sawdust, ground acorns, and occasionally clay dust. The emperor has declared this creative resourcefulness in service of the divine empire, making any complaint about bread quality an act of treason punishable by crucifixion. Your daily ration is precisely weighed on scales calibrated according to imperial specifications. The portion is calculated to provide exactly enough nutrition to maintain your usefulness to the state, while ensuring you remain too hungry to have energy for seditious thoughts. Asking for additional weight suggests greed. Asking for less weight suggests rejection of imperial generosity. The measurements are recorded alongside your name in ledgers that are reviewed weekly by palace administrators, looking for patterns that might indicate disloyalty. Finding anything to supplement your meager bread ration requires venturing into Rome's transformed marketplace, where vendors now operate under the constant scrutiny of imperial price inspectors. Gaius Cornelius, who once sold fresh fish caught in the Tiber, now offers only dried scraps because fresh fish was declared too luxurious for common citizens. When a customer complained that the dried fish smelled rotten, Cornelius was forced to eat a handful himself to prove his product's quality. He spent 3 days writhing in agony before dying, and his stall now displays his head as a warning against criticizing imperial food standards. The vegetable vendors whisper their prices rather than calling them out, because loud advertising might suggest their goods are superior to imperial provisions. Helena the herb seller was arrested last month for enthusiastically praising her onions' quality, which was interpreted as an implicit criticism of the thin, bitter onions distributed through official channels. Her replacement, a nervous young man named Lucius, simply points to his produce and states flatly, "These serve the empire adequately, the only safe description of any consumable goods. Buying anything requires navigating the new imperial currency regulations." Caligula has debased the silver denarii to fund his construction projects, but citizens must accept the degraded coins at face value while pretending not to notice their reduced weight and purity. Questioning coin quality constitutes economic treason. However, merchants are simultaneously forbidden from raising prices to compensate for the devalued currency, creating an economic impossibility that has driven most small traders into bankruptcy or exile. The wine shops operate under particularly bizarre restrictions. Caligula has declared that wine consumption reflects one's appreciation of Bacchus, whom he claims to have personally befriended during his divine ascension. Citizens must purchase wine regularly to demonstrate proper religious observance, but drinking too much suggests excessive indulgence inappropriate for the austere times. Drinking too little suggests insufficient reverence for divine friendship. The wine itself has been watered down to stretch supplies, but commenting on its weakness constitutes criticism of imperial resource management. Eating your acquired food presents its own dangers. The emperor has decreed that all meals must begin with a toast to his divine health and wisdom. Citizens caught eating without performing this ritual face immediate arrest. However, the toast must sound sincere but not overly enthusiastic, grateful but not expectant, respectful but not familiar. The precise tone and phrasing that separates loyalty from mockery changes daily based on the emperor's mood, information that spreads through the city like wildfire as citizens desperately try to avoid the previous day's fatal mistakes. Sharing food with others requires careful consideration of imperial social policy. Generosity might suggest you have more resources than officially reported, implying tax evasion or black market involvement. Refusing to share suggests selfishness inappropriate for citizens of the divine empire. The amount shared must reflect exact social hierarchies. Too much to a social inferior suggests dangerous egalitarian thinking. Too little suggests improper understanding of divine order. Even the act of chewing must be performed with appropriate solemnity. Enjoying food too visibly suggests insufficient awareness of the empire's sacrifices. Showing dissatisfaction suggests criticism of imperial provisioning. Citizens have learned to eat with carefully neutral expressions, mechanical jaw movements, and eyes focused on middle distances to avoid any appearance of inappropriate emotional response to their sustenance. The meal that once brought families together has become a daily performance of loyalty, where every bite is measured, every expression monitored, and every moment of nourishment transformed into an opportunity for surveillance, denunciation, and death. Work in Caligula's Rome has transformed from honest labor into a deadly performance where your survival depends not on your skills, but on your ability to demonstrate unwavering loyalty, while the emperor's madness reshapes the very concept of productive employment. The traditional Roman work ethic has been replaced by imperial paranoia, where every profession has become a potential source of treason, and every workplace a surveillance network designed to identify enemies of the divine state. The construction sites where you might seek employment as a laborer now operate under the oversight of Lucius Valerius, a former centurion appointed as imperial work supervisor, after proving his loyalty by executing 3 workers who complained about unsafe conditions. His interpretation of proper imperial work ethic requires absolute silence during labor, and any conversation might constitute plotting against the emperor. Workers communicate through elaborate hand signals that must be officially approved, as unauthorized gestures could be interpreted as coded seditious messages. Building materials have become scarce and inferior since Caligula diverted the finest marble, bronze, and iron to his personal construction projects. Workers are expected to achieve the same structural integrity using clay bricks that crumble in rain, wooden beams rotted by deliberate neglect, and bronze fittings so thin they bend under minimal stress. However, any suggestion that material quality affects construction outcomes is treated as criticism of imperial resource allocation, punishable by flogging or execution depending on Lucius's mood. The emperor's building projects themselves defy both engineering logic and financial reality. Workers are currently constructing a temple to Caligula's divine essence that requires foundation work in perpetually flooded ground because the emperor insists it must be positioned to catch the first rays of dawn light. When an experienced builder named Gaius Antonius suggested relocating the structure 20 paces to higher ground, he was crucified for questioning divine architectural inspiration. Now workers toil in mud up to their knees, pretending the constantly collapsing foundations represent acceptable progress. Safety equipment is forbidden as it implies divine protection is insufficient for loyal workers. Hard hats suggest lack of faith in imperial blessing. Safety ropes indicate distrust of divine providence. Protective padding implies the emperor's divine influence cannot prevent injury to faithful servants. 3 workers die daily on average, their deaths officially recorded as sacrificial offerings to ensure continued imperial favor in construction endeavors. Payment for labor comes in the form of debased copper coins that lose value faster than workers can spend them, supplemented by ration tokens for bread that often proves inedible. However, workers must express gratitude for compensation while pretending not to notice its inadequacy. Asking for additional payment suggests greed. Requesting better quality rations implies criticism of imperial provisioning. Even inquiring about payment schedules can be interpreted as challenging imperial financial management. The workshops where craftsmen once practiced their trades have become instruments of imperial surveillance. Marcus Fabius, who repairs leather goods, must now report any customer who brings items showing excessive wear. This might indicate they cannot afford replacements due to economic criticism of imperial policies. Sylvia the Weaver was executed for creating cloth patterns that someone interpreted as mocking the emperor's baldness. Every artisan now produces only the most basic, unadorned goods to avoid any possibility of inadvertent offense. Merchants operate under impossible contradictions that guarantee eventual prosecution. They must maintain adequate stock to serve imperial needs while operating with insufficient capital due to confiscatory taxation. They must charge fair prices that allow survival while accepting debased currency at face value. They must enthusiastically promote their goods while avoiding any language that might suggest superiority over imperial provisions. Quintus the Potter solved this by going mute entirely, communicating only through nods and gestures until he was arrested for suspicious silence that might conceal seditious thoughts. The agricultural workers outside the city face perhaps the worst conditions, as Caligula has declared himself a god of fertility while simultaneously requisitioning most livestock and seed grain for imperial banquets and sacrificial spectacles. Farmers must produce abundant harvests using depleted soil, inadequate tools, and minimal seed stock. Crop failures are attributed to insufficient devotion to the divine emperor, making poor harvests literally a matter of life and death for those responsible. Even unemployment has become dangerous. Citizens without work are suspected of deliberately avoiding productive contribution to the imperial economy. However, seeking work too aggressively suggests desperation that might drive someone to treasonous activities. The optimal approach is to appear modestly available for employment while demonstrating that your primary concern is serving the divine emperor rather than personal survival. A balance that shifts daily based on unpredictable imperial whims. The workday ends not with rest but with mandatory participation in productivity assessment sessions where workers must publicly analyze their contributions to imperial glory. These sessions, led by appointed supervisors, require each worker to confess inadequacies in their performance while praising the divine emperor's wisdom in providing them with opportunities to serve. Speaking too little suggests hiding something. Speaking too much suggests inappropriate focus on personal concerns rather than imperial glory. Labor under Caligula has become a daily trial where competence is dangerous, incompetence is fatal, and survival requires performing productive work while pretending that productivity itself is less important than demonstrating absolute submission to an emperor whose divine madness transforms every honest task into a potential capital offense. The streets of Rome have become a gauntlet of terror where every step could be your last, not from the traditional urban hazards of traffic and crime, but from the emperor's network of informants, sudden imperial processions, and the unpredictable enforcement of laws that change faster than the weather. Moving through the city requires the skills of a diplomat, the reflexes of a gladiator, and the luck of someone blessed by gods who aren't currently at war with your emperor. Your route from the construction site to the market must be planned like a military campaign. Certain streets are forbidden during specific hours when Caligula's divine meditation requires absolute silence in surrounding areas. The Via Sacra becomes impassable when the emperor decides to conduct impromptu religious ceremonies, forcing citizens to make dangerous detours through neighborhoods where rival informant networks operate. Yesterday, Marcus Claudius was arrested for taking the back route past the Temple of Vesta because his presence during a sacred hour was interpreted as espionage on religious activities. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sends civilians diving into doorways and behind market stalls, not knowing whether the riders bring imperial messages, arrest warrants, or simply the emperor himself on one of his increasingly erratic tours of the city. When Caligula travels, his route is considered sacred ground that must be purified before and after his passage. Citizens found standing in spaces the imperial litter will traverse or arrested for contaminating divine pathways. Those who fail to clear the route quickly enough are beaten for impeding imperial progress. Crossroads have become particularly dangerous since the emperor declared himself the patron deity of Roman navigation. Every intersection now features a small shrine to Caligula's divine guidance, requiring brief prayers and offerings from passers-by. However, the prayers must be precisely worded according to daily instructions posted by imperial religious officials. Using yesterday's prayer formula suggests either poor attention to imperial communications or deliberate defiance of evolving divine requirements. 3 citizens were crucified last week for reciting outdated intersection prayers. The fountain areas where people traditionally gathered for water and gossip now operate under constant surveillance by Gaius Scribonius, the imperial water-gathering supervisor. He records who drinks how much water, interpreting consumption patterns as indicators of loyalty. Drinking heavily suggests anxiety about something, possibly guilt. Drinking lightly suggests suspicious self-control that might indicate planning for extended absence from imperial oversight. Citizens now approach fountains with carefully rehearsed drinking patterns designed to appear normal while avoiding any behavior that might seem significant. Market squares have transformed from centers of commerce into elaborate theaters of loyalty performance. Vendors must display portraits of the emperor prominently, while customers must acknowledge these images with appropriate reverence before conducting any business. The prescribed acknowledgement involves a specific bow, a brief prayer, and eye contact with the imperial portrait for exactly 3 heartbeats, not 2, which suggests haste, and not 4, which suggests inappropriate intimacy with the divine image. Street corners where idle conversation once occurred now feature posted imperial observers who record the topics, duration, and participants of all discussions. Talking about weather might suggest criticism of the emperor's divine influence over natural phenomena. Discussing family matters could indicate priorities inappropriate for citizens whose primary concern should be imperial service. Even commenting on the quality of morning bread becomes dangerous when food shortages are officially attributed to divine tests of citizen loyalty rather than imperial fiscal mismanagement. The narrow alleyways between buildings present their own unique hazards. These spaces are considered potential hiding spots for seditious activities, making anyone found in them subject to immediate questioning about their purpose and destination. However, using only main streets suggests deliberate avoidance of imperial surveillance, which implies consciousness of guilt about something. Citizens must carefully balance their routes to appear neither suspicious nor suspicious of appearing suspicious. Construction zones throughout the city serve dual purposes as both infrastructure improvement projects and impromptu arrest locations. Workers are empowered to detain anyone whose behavior near imperial building sites seems questionable. Walking too slowly suggests surveillance of imperial construction methods. Walking too quickly suggests urgency inappropriate for citizens whose time belongs to the emperor. Showing interest in building techniques might indicate plans for unauthorized construction. Showing no interest suggests disrespect for imperial architectural vision. Even the simple act of stepping aside for traffic has become regulated. Citizens must move in specific ways that demonstrate proper respect for imperial vehicles while avoiding any gesture that might be interpreted as saluting, mocking, or showing insufficient enthusiasm for imperial presence. The correct sideways movement involves 3 precise steps with downcast eyes and hands positioned at exact angles that have been measured and approved by imperial protocol officials. The most dangerous locations are the areas near the Palatine Hill, where the emperor's presence transforms ordinary spaces into sacred precincts with constantly changing rules. Citizens found within sight of imperial windows during unauthorized hours face immediate arrest. However, avoiding these areas entirely suggests deliberate disrespect for imperial presence. The safe approach requires precise timing, approved routes, and careful attention to daily bulletins announcing which imperial activities might be visible from public spaces. Navigation through Caligula's Rome has become a deadly dance where every movement is choreographed by imperial paranoia, every pause scrutinized for hidden meaning, and every step forward brings you closer to either your destination or your doom. The aqueducts that once symbolized Roman engineering triumph now serve as conduits for imperial terror, where even the act of drinking water has become a political statement subject to deadly interpretation. Caligula has declared himself the divine patron of all water sources, transforming every fountain, bath, and well into a sacred shrine requiring ritualized approach and officially sanctioned appreciation of his aquatic divinity. The public fountains throughout the city operate under the supervision of Quintus Aquilius, the imperial water distribution monitor, who maintains detailed records of every citizen's hydration patterns. Drinking too frequently suggests nervousness about something minus and possibly guilt over unreported seditious activities. Drinking infrequently suggests deliberate rejection of imperial provision, implying that you have access to unauthorized private water sources obtained through treasonous connections. The optimal drinking frequency changes weekly based on imperial mood assessments conducted by palace astrologers. Approaching any water source requires performing the prescribed water gratitude ceremony, a complex ritual involving specific hand gestures, verbal acknowledgments of Caligula's divine water-giving powers, and precise positioning relative to imperial portraits mounted beside every spigot. The ceremony must appear spontaneous while following exact specifications, grateful without seeming calculated and reverential without suggesting excessive familiarity with divine essence. Citizens practice these rituals in private, knowing that improper performance could result in immediate arrest for water ceremony violations. The quality of water itself has deteriorated dramatically since Caligula diverted most aqueduct maintenance funds to construct elaborate fountain displays in his private palaces. The public supply now carries a distinctive brownish tint and metallic taste that citizens must pretend not to notice, as commenting on water quality constitutes criticism of imperial infrastructure management. When Senator Lucius Crassus mentioned that the water seemed cloudy, he was arrested for spreading rumors designed to undermine confidence in divine provision. His execution by drowning was declared poetically appropriate. Bathing has become an exercise in political theater where cleanliness takes second priority to demonstrating proper loyalty during ablutions. The public baths now feature mandatory pre-bathing inspections where attendants examine citizens for any marks, scars, or skin conditions that might suggest involvement in suspicious activities. Fresh wounds could indicate recent fights with imperial authorities. Old scars might suggest a violent past that threatens current order. Unusual cleanliness might indicate preparation for escape or important meetings with seditious contacts. The bath water itself is changed infrequently due to cost-cutting measures imposed to fund Caligula's aquatic construction projects. Citizens must express gratitude for the opportunity to bathe in water previously blessed by the presence of other loyal subjects, while carefully avoiding any facial expression that might suggest displeasure with the murky, oil-slicked liquid that bears traces of soap, sweat, and substances better left unidentified. Bathhouse conversations are monitored by Gaius Balneator, the imperial bathing supervisor who floats through the pools on a small wooden platform recording discussions while pretending to test water temperature. Speaking too loudly suggests inappropriate comfort with public nakedness. Speaking too quietly implies secretive planning. The safest approach is ritualized small talk about approved topics, gratitude for imperial provision, appreciation of divine engineering, and carefully neutral observations about weather that avoid any suggestion that natural phenomena operate independently of imperial influence. Soap has become a luxury item heavily taxed to fund imperial aquatic projects, forcing most citizens to bathe using sand, ash, or rough cloths that leave skin raw and bleeding. However, appearing too clean suggests access to black market soap obtained through treasonous trade networks. Appearing too dirty suggests disrespect for the cleanliness standards appropriate in a divine empire. Citizens must achieve an optimal level of controlled grubbiness that demonstrates both respect for imperial resource allocation and appropriate attention to personal hygiene. The drainage systems throughout the city have been modified to include imperial observation ports where appointed inspectors monitor the flow of used water for evidence of suspicious activities. Washing blood from clothing might indicate violence against imperial representatives. Unusual amounts of soap residue could suggest illegal trading in luxury hygiene products. Even excessive food particles in drainage could imply criticism of imperial rationing through wasteful food disposal. Women face additional scrutiny during their bathing routines as Caligula has declared himself the divine protector of feminine virtue while simultaneously demanding detailed reports on female bathing habits. The female bath attendants must document the duration, thoroughness, and apparent purpose of each woman's cleansing activities. Bathing too briefly suggests inappropriate haste possibly related to secret meetings. Bathing too thoroughly suggests vanity inappropriate during austere imperial times. Pregnant women receive special observation to ensure their condition doesn't interfere with proper appreciation of imperial bathing facilities. Private washing arrangements have been declared illegal except for medical emergencies, certified by imperial physicians. Citizens caught with private water stores face execution for hoarding resources that belong to the divine emperor. However, appearing before imperial inspectors in obviously unwashed condition suggests deliberate rejection of public bathing opportunities provided by imperial generosity. The impossible balance between legal compliance and basic hygiene has created a population of citizens who exist in a constant state of controlled filth, afraid to be too clean or too dirty. The ultimate irony of Caligula's water policies is that while he demands absolute reverence for his divine control over aquatic resources, his own palaces feature elaborate private bath systems using the finest marble, heated water, and imported soaps, creating a stark contrast that citizens must pretend not to notice, while struggling to maintain basic cleanliness using inadequate public facilities under constant surveillance. Pain in Caligula's Rome has become both a physical reality and a political performance, where your response to suffering must demonstrate proper imperial loyalty, while navigating the emperor's twisted philosophy that bodily agony serves as evidence of divine testing. Every wince, groan, or cry of distress is scrutinized for signs of insufficient stoicism, inappropriate weakness, or worse, implicit criticism of the divine emperor's ability to protect his faithful subjects from harm. The construction accident that crushes your left hand beneath a falling stone block presents an immediate test of imperial loyalty. As blood streams between your fingers and bone fragments pierce through torn skin, you must maintain the prescribed expression of grateful acceptance while avoiding any sound that might suggest the Emperor's divine protection was insufficient. Screaming implies lack of faith in imperial blessing. Excessive silence suggests suspicious self-control that might indicate preparation for martyrdom. The optimal response requires measured groans of acknowledgement mixed with verbal gratitude for the learning opportunity provided by divine will. Seeking medical attention means navigating the imperial healthcare system, where physicians must balance actual treatment with political loyalty demonstrations. Marcus Medicus, the licensed bone setter appointed to your district, begins every consultation by examining injuries for evidence of seditious activities. Fresh wounds might indicate recent conflicts with imperial authorities. Old injuries could suggest a violent past incompatible with loyal citizenship. Self-inflicted damage might represent preparation for false testimony about imperial brutality. The treatment itself becomes a carefully choreographed performance of imperial medicine. Traditional Roman remedies have been modified to include mandatory prayers to Caligula's divine healing powers during every procedure. Setting broken bones requires specific invocations acknowledging the emperor's wisdom in allowing the injury to occur for educational purposes. Cleaning wounds must be accompanied by verbal gratitude for the opportunity to appreciate imperial medical provision. Pain relief is limited to imperial-approved substances that ensure suffering remains visible as evidence of proper submission to divine will. Your crushed hand receives treatment consisting of honey, vinegar, and prayers to the Emperor's divine surgical guidance. The honey is heavily taxed imperial honey, inferior in quality but politically safe. The vinegar has been blessed by imperial religious officials, making it sacred but less effective. The prayers must be recited with perfect pronunciation while maintaining eye contact with a portrait of Caligula mounted above the treatment table. Mispronouncing divine invocations during medical procedures constitutes both medical malpractice and religious heresy. The bandages used to wrap your injury bear imperial seals and must be worn in specific configurations that demonstrate proper respect for imperial textile provision. Unwrapping bandages before officially prescribed times suggests impatience with divine healing schedules. Leaving bandages on longer than specified suggests excessive attachment to imperial materials. The optimal bandage wearing period requires daily consultation with imperial medical scheduling officials who determine healing timelines based on astrological calculations rather than actual wound assessment. Recovery from injury becomes a public demonstration of imperial healing effectiveness. You must appear in designated public spaces during specific hours to allow imperial medical inspectors to document your progress as evidence of the emperor's divine healing powers. Healing too quickly suggests the injury wasn't serious enough to warrant imperial medical attention. Healing too slowly suggests insufficient faith in divine medical provision or possible interference with imperial healing through unauthorized private treatment. Working with your injured hand requires careful performance of imperial disability accommodation policies. Reduced productivity must be acknowledged through daily confessions of inadequacy while maintaining verbal gratitude for the emperor's patience with temporary physical limitations. Requesting modified duties suggests criticism of imperial work assignments. Refusing modified duties suggests prideful rejection of imperial accommodation. The balance requires precisely calculated expressions of humble gratitude mixed with apologetic acknowledgement of reduced imperial service capacity. The constant pain from nerve damage in your partially healed hand must be managed without any expression that might suggest criticism of imperial medical outcomes. Visible pain suggests dissatisfaction with divine healing provision. Lack of visible pain suggests dissection about the injury's severity. Citizens have developed elaborate facial control techniques to display optimal pain levels, enough to acknowledge divine testing but not enough to suggest imperial medical inadequacy. Pain medication, when available, comes with strict usage guidelines established by imperial pharmaceutical policies. Using too much pain relief suggests weakness inappropriate for citizens serving a divine emperor. Using too little suggests rejection of imperial medical provision. The prescribed dosage changes weekly based on imperial medical officers' assessments of appropriate suffering levels for different classes of citizens. Aristocrats receive more pain relief to maintain their effectiveness in imperial service. Common citizens receive less to build character through divine testing. Other citizens' injuries become opportunities for loyalty demonstrations through appropriate sympathy performances. Showing too much concern for others' pain suggests priorities inappropriate for subjects whose primary focus should be imperial service. Showing too little concern suggests callousness incompatible with the emperor's compassionate divine nature. The optimal response requires calibrated expressions of sympathetic awareness mixed with verbal reminders that all suffering serves imperial purposes. Chronic pain from old injuries must be managed as a permanent loyalty test. Citizens develop elaborate strategies for existing in constant discomfort while maintaining productivity and appropriate enthusiasm for imperial service. Knowing that any sign of pain-induced irritability could be interpreted as criticism of the divine emperor's healing capabilities or insufficient gratitude for the character-building opportunities provided by persistent suffering. The physicians of Caligula's Rome have been transformed from healers into imperial loyalty enforcers, where medical diagnosis serves political purposes and treatment outcomes must align with the emperor's divine medical theories regardless of actual patient welfare. Every symptom is analyzed not just for physical causes, but for evidence of seditious thoughts, insufficient imperial devotion, or resistance to divine will that manifests through bodily rebellion against the perfect order of Caligula's reign. Gaius Hippocraticus, the imperial chief medical officer, has developed an entirely new diagnostic system based on the emperor's personal medical revelations received during divine visions. Traditional Roman medicine focused on balancing the four humors, but Caligula's medicine requires balancing loyalty, fear, gratitude, and submission. The four emotional humors that determine both physical health and political reliability. Illness is now interpreted as evidence of insufficient emotional alignment with imperial perfection. Your fever, developed after working in contaminated water at the construction site, is diagnosed as thermal rebellion syndrome, a condition caused by your body's subconscious resistance to accepting the emperor's divine temperature control over your personal climate. The prescribed treatment involves daily ice baths while reciting prayers acknowledging Caligula's authority over all thermal phenomena, followed by exposure to heated rooms while expressing gratitude for imperial warming. The temperature extremes are designed to break your body's unauthorized thermal independence. The medical examination itself becomes an interrogation where physical symptoms are treated as confessions of political crimes. Your rapid pulse is interpreted as anxiety about hidden seditious activities. Your pale complexion suggests guilt about unreported anti-imperial thoughts. The tremor in your hands indicates nervous preparation for violent activities against the state. Even normal bodily functions become evidence. Regular breathing patterns suggest suspicious self-control, while irregular breathing implies emotional instability that might lead to treasonous outbursts. Treatment protocols must incorporate mandatory political education alongside medical intervention. While receiving bloodletting therapy to balance your seditious humors, you must listen to daily readings from imperial medical texts describing Caligula's revolutionary discoveries about the relationship between loyalty and health. The bloodletting continues until you can recite these passages from memory while maintaining appropriate reverence for the emperor's medical genius, regardless of how much blood you've lost. The medicines prescribed come from the imperial pharmacy, where traditional remedies have been modified to include political loyalty enhancement ingredients. Your fever medication contains extract of imperial laurel leaves that must be consumed while facing east toward the emperor's palace. The bitter taste must be acknowledged as evidence of the medicine's potency rather than poor preparation. Complaining about medication flavor constitutes criticism of imperial pharmaceutical research and development. Medical procedures require constant political performance from both patient and physician. During your wound cleaning, you must maintain verbal appreciation for the emperor's divine surgical guidance while the doctor recites imperial medical prayers. Any involuntary reaction to pain must be immediately followed by acknowledgement that discomfort serves educational purposes designed by divine wisdom. The physician must document not just medical progress but also your political reliability throughout treatment. Recovery expectations are established based on imperial medical theory rather than actual healing timelines. Citizens must recover according to schedules determined by palace medical advisors who calculate healing rates based on astrological charts and the emperor's mood assessments. Recovering faster than predicted suggests your illness wasn't serious enough to warrant imperial medical attention. Recovering slower suggests resistance to imperial healing or possible interference from unauthorized private remedies. The most dangerous aspect of imperial medicine is the requirement to report other citizens' suspicious medical symptoms. Physicians must document any patient who shows signs of political illness, conditions that might indicate seditious thinking. Insomnia suggests guilty consciousness keeping you awake. Excessive sleeping implies avoidance of imperial service obligations. Digestive problems might indicate inability to stomach imperial policies. Even headaches become suspicious when they coincide with imperial speeches or announcements. Women's medical care includes mandatory examination for signs of inappropriate sexual activity that might compromise imperial moral standards. Pregnancies must be reported and monitored to ensure the developing child will be suitable for imperial service. Fertility problems are analyzed for evidence of deliberate population control designed to deprive the emperor of future subjects. Menstrual irregularities might indicate emotional instability caused by insufficient appreciation of imperial feminine protection policies. Mental health treatment focuses entirely on correcting political thoughts rather than addressing psychological symptoms. Citizens showing signs of depression receive mandatory daily attendance at imperial celebration events designed to restore proper appreciation for life under divine rule. Anxiety is treated through forced participation in loyalty demonstrations that should naturally reduce worry by confirming imperial protection. Any suggestion that mental distress might have causes unrelated to political loyalty is considered evidence of dangerous psychological independence. The ultimate goal of imperial medicine is not healing but political conditioning through medical authority. Citizens learn to associate physical wellness with political compliance, creating a population that fears both illness and treatment while remaining dependent on imperial medical provision. Your body becomes another instrument of state control, where even biological functions must demonstrate loyalty to an emperor whose medical theories serve power rather than health. The evening meal in Caligula's Rome has transformed from a simple act of nourishment into an elaborate ritual of imperial worship, where every bite must be consumed according to divine dietary regulations and every swallow monitored for signs of insufficient appreciation for the emperor's generous food provision. What remains of dinner after the emperor's requisitions for his floating palace banquets barely qualifies as sustenance, consisting mainly of grain porridge stretched with sawdust and flavored with the tears of citizens who remember when food actually filled their stomachs. Your evening ration is distributed by Lucius Alimentarius, the imperial food distribution supervisor, who weighs each portion with the precision of a goldsmith and the paranoia of a spy. The prescribed amount, exactly 3½ ounces of processed grain mixed with 2 ounces of liquid that once resembled broth, is calculated to provide adequate nutrition for imperial service while ensuring citizens remain too hungry to waste energy on seditious thoughts. Requesting additional food suggests greed inappropriate for the austere times imposed by divine fiscal responsibility. Declining any portion implies criticism of imperial nutritional planning. The grain itself has been processed in imperial mills where traditional grinding methods have been modified to remove nutrients that might provide citizens with excessive energy for unauthorized activities. The resulting powder bears the texture of fine sand and the flavor of imperial dedication, which is to say, none whatsoever. Citizens must express verbal gratitude for this concentrated essence of imperial agricultural success, while carefully avoiding any facial expression that might suggest the food tastes like ground pottery mixed with disappointment. Preparation of your meager meal requires compliance with imperial cooking regulations established after Caligula declared himself the divine patron of all culinary activities. The clay pot you use must first be blessed with prayers acknowledging the emperor's wisdom in providing cookware to his subjects. The fire must be lit using imperial-approved methods that demonstrate proper respect for divine control over combustion. Even the stirring motion must follow prescribed patterns that honor the emperor's revolutionary insights into optimal food mixing techniques. The liquid component of your meal comes from communal cauldrons monitored by imperial nutrition inspectors who ensure proper dilution ratios designed to maximize imperial resource efficiency. The broth, originally made from vegetable scraps and occasional bone fragments, has been stretched with water until it resembles flavored liquid more than actual soup. However, citizens must refer to this mixture using only approved terminology, imperial hydrated nutrition essence, as calling it watery suggests criticism of divine culinary resource management. Seasoning options are limited to salt provided through imperial distribution channels, heavily taxed to fund the emperor's elaborate kitchen projects in his private palaces. The salt itself has been diluted with ground marble chips to extend supply, creating a seasoning that provides minimal flavor enhancement while slowly wearing down citizens' teeth. Complaining about salt quality constitutes criticism of imperial mining operations. Using too much salt suggests wasteful disregard for imperial resources. Using too little suggests insufficient appreciation for imperial seasoning provision. The eating process requires careful adherence to imperial dining etiquette that transforms consumption into political theater. Each spoonful must be consumed while maintaining eye contact with portraits of Caligula mounted in every eating area. Chewing must be performed with appropriate solemnity. Too vigorous suggests animalistic behavior, inappropriate for citizens of a divine empire, while too delicate implies aristocratic pretensions above your social station. Swallowing must be followed by verbal acknowledgement of imperial nutritional wisdom. Conversation during meals operates under strict imperial guidelines designed to ensure dining experiences serve educational purposes rather than social bonding. Discussing food quality might suggest criticism of imperial provisioning. Mentioning hunger could imply inadequate imperial feeding policies. Even commenting on weather becomes dangerous when food shortages are officially attributed to divine atmospheric testing rather than the emperor's diversion of agricultural resources to feed his exotic animal collections. Sharing food with family members requires navigation of imperial social policies that regulate domestic food distribution. Parents must ensure children receive adequate nutrition while demonstrating that family loyalty remains secondary to imperial service. Children must show appropriate gratitude for parental provision while acknowledging that their primary allegiance belongs to the divine emperor. The precise balance between family care and imperial devotion shifts daily based on policy announcements that arrive without warning or explanation. Cleanup after meals involves disposal of food waste according to imperial environmental regulations. Leftover food must be saved for potential imperial inspection to verify that citizens are consuming appropriate quantities. Discarding food might suggest wasteful rejection of imperial provision. Saving too much food might indicate hoarding for unauthorized private meals. Even washing dishes requires specific procedures that demonstrate respect for imperial dish cleaning wisdom while avoiding any waste of water that belongs to the divine emperor. The evening meal concludes with mandatory gratitude ceremonies where citizens must publicly acknowledge the emperor's generosity in providing sustenance while carefully avoiding any suggestion that more food might be appreciated. These ceremonies serve as daily reminders that survival itself depends on imperial benevolence, creating a population that associates basic nutrition with political submission rather than human necessity. Your hunger persists after consuming your prescribed ration, but expressing continued appetite constitutes evidence of greed inappropriate for citizens whose primary purpose is serving imperial glory rather than satisfying personal needs. Entertainment in Caligula's Rome has been weaponized into an instrument of terror, where what passes for public amusement serves primarily to demonstrate the emperor's absolute power over life and death while providing convenient opportunities for identifying and eliminating citizens whose reactions suggest insufficient enthusiasm for imperial brutality. The traditional Roman love of spectacle has been perverted into mandatory attendance at increasingly bizarre performances designed not to entertain but to test loyalty through witnessed atrocity. The Colosseum now operates under the direct supervision of Gaius Sanguinarius, the imperial entertainment coordinator, who has transformed gladiatorial combat from skilled martial competition into random slaughter orchestrated according to the emperor's daily whims. Today's program features condemned prisoners forced to fight exotic animals imported at enormous expense from the emperor's African expeditions, lions fed on human flesh to increase their aggression, elephants trained to crush specific body parts in sequence, and crocodiles arranged in elaborate water displays that double as execution chambers. Your mandatory attendance begins with the loyalty verification process, where imperial entertainment inspectors examine citizens for appropriate enthusiasm levels before permitting entry. Facial expressions must show eager anticipation for imperial entertainment without suggesting bloodlust inappropriate for civilized subjects. Clothing must be clean enough to demonstrate respect for imperial venues without being so fine as to suggest wealth that might rival imperial magnificence. Even your walking pace is scrutinized. Too fast suggests unseemly excitement for violence. Too slow implies reluctance to witness imperial justice. The seating arrangements have been redesigned to facilitate surveillance of audience reactions during particularly brutal moments. Citizens are positioned according to loyalty classifications determined by imperial behavioral assessment teams. Suspected dissidents are placed in special observation sections where their every expression is recorded by trained watchers who document inappropriate responses to imperial entertainment. Cheering too loudly suggests possible mockery. Remaining silent suggests criticism of imperial programming. The optimal response requires calibrated enthusiasm that demonstrates proper appreciation without suggesting personal enjoyment of suffering. Today's featured entertainment begins with the emperor's personal appearance in a golden chariot pulled by condemned senators crawling on hands and knees while wearing horse bridles. Caligula himself wears a crown made from melted down coins seized from citizens accused of economic crimes, creating a visual reminder that imperial wealth comes directly from subject sacrifice. The crowd must demonstrate appropriate awe at this display while carefully avoiding any reaction that might suggest the spectacle appears ridiculous rather than magnificent. The gladiatorial matches have been modified to serve educational purposes about imperial justice. Instead of professional fighters, the arena features citizens accused of various loyalty violations forced to battle each other using weapons selected by the emperor based on the nature of their supposed crimes. Tax evaders receive wooden clubs, critics of imperial policy fight with kitchen knives. Those accused of insufficient religious devotion must combat using only their bare hands against armed opponents. Between combat events, the emperor provides personal commentary on the proceedings through a golden speaking trumpet that amplifies his voice throughout the arena. His observations about fighter technique, audience behavior, and the moral lessons demonstrated by each death must be acknowledged through synchronized responses from the crowd. Failing to laugh at imperial jokes suggests inability to appreciate divine humor. Laughing too enthusiastically implies mockery of imperial wit. Citizens practice appropriate laughter patterns in private to avoid fatal response miscalculations. The most disturbing entertainment involves the emperor's theatrical productions, where citizens are forced to participate in dramatic reenactments of mythological scenes with real consequences. Today's performance features the story of Prometheus, with actual citizens chained to artificial rocks while trained eagles consume their livers. The emperor himself plays Zeus, directing the torture while providing divine justification for each scream. Audience members must show appropriate reverence for imperial acting ability while witnessing genuine human suffering presented as divine entertainment. Intermission periods feature mandatory participation in imperial loyalty games where citizens compete in contests designed to demonstrate devotion to the emperor's divine essence. Contestants must answer questions about imperial achievements, recite prayers to Caligula's godhood, and perform physical tasks that prove their willingness to sacrifice personal dignity for imperial amusement. Winners receive small food rations. Losers become participants in the next gladiatorial event. The day's entertainment concludes with the emperor's personal selection of citizens from the audience to join impromptu performances. Being chosen represents both honor and potential death sentence, as imperial favor can shift instantly based on performance quality. Citizens selected for participation must demonstrate appropriate gratitude for the opportunity while executing whatever role the emperor assigns, whether it involves combat, humiliation, or serving as target practice for imperial archers. Leaving the arena requires passing through imperial departure inspection, where citizens' emotional states are evaluated for signs of inappropriate responses to the day's events. Appearing too disturbed suggests criticism of imperial entertainment quality. Appearing unaffected implies callousness inappropriate for subjects witnessing divine justice. The optimal departure demeanor requires visible but controlled emotional processing that suggests proper appreciation for imperial educational entertainment without indicating personal trauma that might interfere with continued loyal service. Entertainment under Caligula has become compulsory participation in imperial madness, where survival depends on demonstrating enthusiasm for witnessing atrocities while maintaining emotional stability sufficient for continued productivity in service of an emperor whose idea of amusement involves turning human suffering into performance art. Justice in Caligula's Rome has been transformed from a system of laws into a theatrical performance of imperial whim, where legal proceedings serve primarily as entertainment for an emperor who treats human lives as expendable props in his divine comedy. The traditional Roman legal framework has been replaced by a nightmare of arbitrary enforcement where innocence and guilt are determined not by evidence but by the emperor's momentary mood and the entertainment value of various punishment options. The courts now operate under the supervision of Lucius Juridicus, the imperial justice coordinator, who has redesigned legal proceedings to maximize spectacle while ensuring that all outcomes ultimately serve the emperor's political and entertainment needs. Trials have become public performances where the verdict is predetermined based on the emperor's assessment of each case's potential for amusing consequences rather than any consideration of actual justice or legal precedent. Your appearance before the imperial magistrate results from an accusation by your neighbor Gaius Accusator, who reported that you failed to display sufficient enthusiasm during yesterday's mandatory celebration of the emperor's divine birthday. The specific charges include insufficient facial animation during imperial festivities, suspicious restraint in applause volume, and possible interior resistance to prescribed celebration participation. These accusations carry penalties ranging from public flogging to crucifixion depending on the entertainment requirements of the day's court schedule. The courtroom itself has been redesigned as an amphitheater where legal proceedings provide entertainment for audiences required to attend as part of their civic duties. Citizens must demonstrate appropriate reactions to testimony, evidence presentation, and sentencing announcements. Gasping too dramatically at shocking revelations suggests theatrical insincerity. Remaining composed during disturbing testimony implies callousness inappropriate for empathetic imperial subjects. The audience's performance becomes part of the trial record, with inappropriate reactions leading to additional charges against spectators. Legal representation operates according to imperial advocacy regulations that prioritize political loyalty over client defense. Your assigned advocate, Marcus Defensius, begins by acknowledging the emperor's divine wisdom in providing legal proceedings for accused citizens while expressing confidence that imperial justice will produce outcomes beneficial to the state regardless of your personal fate. His defense strategy focuses not on proving innocence but on demonstrating that your punishment will serve educational purposes for other citizens while providing appropriate entertainment value for imperial audiences. Evidence presentation follows imperial legal protocols designed to maximize dramatic impact rather than factual accuracy. Witnesses testify not about what they observed, but about their emotional responses to your alleged insufficient celebration enthusiasm. Your neighbor describes feeling personally affronted by your restrained clapping. A passing stranger claims your facial expression during imperial hymn singing suggested possible mental reservation about the emperor's divine musical composition abilities. Even your own family members are required to testify about domestic behaviors that might indicate underlying disloyalty. The prosecution case presented by Imperial Prosecutor Gaius Accusatius focuses on the broader implications of celebration restraint for imperial security. Your insufficient enthusiasm, he argues, represents a dangerous precedent that might encourage other citizens to moderate their expressions of imperial devotion. He presents mathematical calculations showing how reduced celebration volume across the population could theoretically diminish the total quantity of imperial worship, thereby weakening the emperor's divine power and threatening the stability of the empire. Cross-examination procedures have been modified to serve educational purposes about the importance of absolute imperial loyalty. Rather than challenging witness testimony, your advocate must demonstrate proper legal technique while ensuring that questioning actually reinforces the prosecution's arguments. Asking too aggressive questions suggests disrespect for imperial justice. Failing to question witnesses thoroughly implies inadequate legal representation that dishonors the emperor's provision of advocacy services. The most terrifying aspect of imperial justice is the sentencing process, where punishments are selected not based on legal precedent, but on the emperor's assessment of various options' entertainment and educational value. Caligula personally reviews all cases through written summaries that emphasize dramatic potential rather than legal considerations. Standard sentences include public humiliation rituals, gladiatorial combat participation, service as human target practice for imperial archery demonstrations, or inclusion in the emperor's mythological reenactment productions. You're sentenced 3 days of public confession sessions where you must repeatedly acknowledge the inadequacy of your celebration performance while demonstrating proper enthusiasm techniques. Represents a relatively merciful outcome that reflects the emperor's divine generosity rather than any legal consideration of proportional punishment. The confession sessions will be recorded by imperial scribes and used as educational materials for training other citizens in appropriate celebration behavior. Appeals processes exist only to provide additional entertainment opportunities for the emperor, who enjoys reversing previous decisions based on new information about appellants' entertainment potential. Citizens occasionally receive pardons that are immediately followed by new charges based on their reactions to imperial mercy. The unpredictability of imperial justice creates a legal system where survival depends not on legal knowledge but on understanding the emperor's psychological patterns and entertainment preferences. Legal compliance requires citizens to navigate an impossible maze of regulations that change daily based on imperial mood assessments. Yesterday's legal behavior becomes today's capital offense without warning or explanation. Citizens must simultaneously follow written laws, unwritten customs, imperial preferences, and divine inspirations that conflict with each other, creating a legal environment where everyone is technically guilty of something punishable by death. Religion in Caligula's Rome has been transformed from spiritual practice into a mandatory performance of imperial worship, where the emperor's declaration of his own divinity has created a theological nightmare requiring citizens to navigate impossible contradictions between traditional Roman religious duties and the new requirements of worshipping a living God whose divine commands change as frequently as his moods. Every prayer, offering, and ritual gesture must now acknowledge Caligula's supreme divinity while somehow maintaining reverence for the traditional pantheon he claims to have superseded. The morning religious obligations begin before dawn with mandatory participation in the imperial divine awakening ceremony, where citizens must gather in designated public spaces to perform synchronized prayers welcoming the divine emperor's return to consciousness. The ceremony requires precise timing. Arriving too early suggests impatience with divine sleep patterns, while arriving late implies disrespect for the moment of imperial awakening. The prayers themselves must be recited with exact pronunciation of Caligula's divine titles, which now include Jupiter incarnate, divine master of all elements and sacred emperor of earth and heaven. Gaius Pontificus, the imperial religious coordinator, oversees all spiritual activities with the fervor of a fanatic and the paranoia of a spy. He has established religious inspection teams that monitor citizens' prayer techniques, offering quantities and facial expressions during worship to ensure proper reverence for the emperor's divine essence. Traditional Roman religious practices must now incorporate acknowledgement of Caligula's supremacy over all previously worshipped deities, creating theological complications that citizens must navigate without appearing confused by the contradictory religious requirements. The temple complexes throughout the city have been modified to accommodate the new imperial theology. Traditional shrines to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus now feature prominent statues of Caligula positioned to overshadow the original deities, with inscriptions declaring the emperor's divine authority over these lesser gods. Citizens must approach traditional altars through new pathways that require first acknowledging Caligula's divine permission to worship other deities, creating ritualized subordination of the entire Roman pantheon to imperial authority. Your daily religious schedule now includes 7 mandatory prayer sessions corresponding to different aspects of the emperor's divine nature. Morning prayers address his solar divinity as the new sun god. Midday worship acknowledges his authority over justice and law. Afternoon rituals celebrate his divine military leadership. Evening prayers recognize his power over fertility and abundance. Each prayer session requires specific postures, hand gestures, and vocal intonations that must be performed perfectly to avoid charges of religious inadequacy. The most dangerous religious requirement involves participation in the imperial divine meal sharing ceremony, where citizens must symbolically consume bread and wine that represent the emperor's divine body and blood. This ritual, borrowed from mystery religions and twisted to serve imperial ego, requires participants to express genuine spiritual communion with Caligula's divine essence while consuming food that often tastes of imperial neglect and political desperation. Appearing insufficiently moved by this spiritual experience suggests resistance to imperial divinity. Offerings to the emperor's divine essence must be calibrated according to complex regulations that balance demonstration of proper reverence with acknowledgement of citizens' limited resources. Too generous offerings suggest wealth that might rival imperial magnificence. Too modest offerings imply insufficient appreciation for divine favor. The offerings themselves must be personally meaningful. Sacrificing something valueless suggests disrespect for imperial divinity, while sacrificing something too precious might indicate priorities inappropriate for subjects whose primary devotion belongs to the emperor. Traditional Roman religious festivals have been restructured to center on imperial divinity rather than seasonal celebrations or traditional deities. The Lupercalia now honors Caligula's divine fertility powers rather than the wolf god Lupercus. Saturnalia celebrates the emperor's generous reversal of social order rather than the agricultural deity Saturn. Citizens must participate enthusiastically in these modified celebrations while pretending not to notice how the familiar religious calendar has been hijacked to serve imperial ego. The emperor's religious innovation includes mandatory confession sessions where citizens must publicly acknowledge their spiritual inadequacies and request divine forgiveness for insufficient worship of imperial divinity. These confessions, conducted under the supervision of imperial religious officials, require detailed admission of specific religious failures while demonstrating genuine remorse for spiritual inadequacy. The confessions are recorded and used as evidence of citizens' religious reliability or potential disloyalty. Private religious practices have been declared illegal except when they explicitly subordinate personal spiritual needs to imperial worship obligations. Citizens caught maintaining household shrines without prominent imperial imagery face charges of religious separatism. Family prayers must include acknowledgement of the emperor's divine authority over domestic spiritual life. Even personal meditation requires official approval to ensure that private spiritual practices don't interfere with mandatory imperial worship duties. The most psychologically destructive aspect of imperial religion is the requirement to maintain genuine spiritual conviction about Caligula's divinity, while simultaneously witnessing daily evidence of his human weaknesses, cruelties, and obvious mental instability. Citizens must perform convincing worship of divine perfection while observing the emperor's petty rages, arbitrary decisions, and manifest failures of divine wisdom. This cognitive dissonance creates a population of spiritually broken individuals who have learned to separate religious performance from actual belief. Religious enforcement operates through a network of imperial spiritual inspectors who evaluate citizens' worship authenticity using criteria that change unpredictably based on theological innovations announced without warning. Yesterday's proper religious behavior becomes today's heretical practice, forcing citizens to constantly adapt their spiritual performances while maintaining the appearance of sincere devotion to an emperor whose divine authority rests solely on his willingness to execute anyone who questions his theological claims. The social order in Caligula's Rome has been transformed into a deadly game of imperial favoritism where traditional Roman class distinctions have been replaced by a system based entirely on the emperor's momentary preferences and personal entertainment needs. The careful balance of patrician privilege, plebeian rights, and slavery that once structured Roman society has collapsed into chaos where senators crawl like animals for imperial amusement while former slaves rise to positions of power based solely on their ability to amuse or flatter the divine emperor. Your position in this twisted hierarchy shifts daily based on factors beyond your control or understanding. Marcus Hierarchicus, the imperial social classification administrator, maintains detailed records of every citizen's current status according to metrics that include loyalty demonstration scores, entertainment value assessments, physical appearance evaluations, and mysterious imperial preference calculations that seem to operate according to no discernible logic. Citizens wake each morning uncertain whether they will spend the day as honored subjects or condemned criminals. The traditional patron-client relationships that once provided social stability have been weaponized into instruments of mutual surveillance and betrayal. Your former patron, Gaius Protector, who once offered protection in exchange for political support, now serves primarily as an informant who reports your behavior to imperial authorities while demanding increasingly humiliating demonstrations of loyalty that serve no purpose except proving your willingness to abandon personal dignity for perceived security. Seeking advancement in this system requires navigating impossible contradictions where every behavior that might elevate your status simultaneously creates vulnerability that could lead to destruction. Demonstrating exceptional competence suggests dangerous independence that might threaten imperial authority. Showing incompetence implies inadequate service to imperial needs. The optimal approach requires carefully calibrated mediocrity that appears useful without seeming threatening, skilled without being superior, and devoted without being calculating. The emperor's court operates as a theater of grotesque flattery where traditional Roman virtues have been replaced by the ability to praise Caligula's non-existent achievements while ignoring his obvious failures. Courtiers compete to devise increasingly elaborate compliments about the emperor's divine wisdom, military genius, physical beauty, and artistic talents that exist only in their terrified imaginations. Yesterday's successful flatterer becomes today's executed fool when imperial mood shifts make previous praise inappropriate or insufficient. Social mobility now depends entirely on entertainment value rather than merit, wealth, or family connections. Citizens rise and fall based on their ability to amuse the emperor through creative humiliation, innovative loyalty demonstrations, or willingness to serve as props in imperial theatrical productions. A former senator named Lucius Dignitas currently serves as the emperor's personal footstool during audiences, while a freedman named Servus Comicus has been elevated to advisory positions based solely on his talent for making the emperor laugh during executions. The most dangerous social position involves any relationship that predates Caligula's reign, as previous loyalties and friendships are automatically suspect as potential centers of resistance to imperial authority. Long-term marriages must be dissolved if they suggest emotional priorities that compete with devotion to the emperor. Childhood friendships become evidence of conspiracy potential. Even family relationships require constant renegotiation to demonstrate that blood ties remain secondary to imperial loyalty. Women navigate this system through a separate but equally treacherous hierarchy where traditional Roman feminine roles have been replaced by imperial entertainment requirements. Some women advance through willingness to participate in the emperor's elaborate sexual fantasies, while others gain status by informing on their husbands, fathers, or sons. The emperor's own sisters serve as examples of how feminine imperial favor can elevate women to goddess-like status while simultaneously making them targets for his unpredictable rage. Professional relationships have become impossible to maintain as traditional Roman occupational ethics conflict with imperial service requirements. Physicians must choose between accurate medical practice and politically safe diagnoses. Teachers must replace classical education with imperial propaganda. Merchants must balance customer service with informing on suspicious purchasing patterns. Every profession becomes a form of imperial service where competence and loyalty often contradict each other. The senator class, once the pinnacle of Roman society, now exists primarily to provide imperial entertainment through ritualized humiliation. Senators are required to participate in degrading ceremonies that demonstrate their submission to imperial authority while maintaining the pretense that they retain some vestige of traditional dignity. Some senators wear women's clothing to imperial banquets. Others perform menial labor while wearing senatorial purple. A few have been trained to perform animal tricks for imperial amusement. Social gatherings operate under imperial surveillance protocols that transform every conversation into potential evidence for treason trials. Citizens must balance the social obligations of maintaining relationships with the political necessity of reporting suspicious behavior. Dinner parties become information-gathering operations. Wedding celebrations turn into loyalty demonstrations. Funeral services provide opportunities to document who shows excessive grief for condemned individuals. The ultimate cruelty of this social system is its complete unpredictability. There are no reliable strategies for advancement or even survival because the emperor's preferences change without warning or explanation. Citizens who succeed through one approach may find that same behavior leads to execution when imperial fashion shifts. The only constant is the requirement to appear grateful for whatever position you occupy while remaining ready to abandon everything when imperial whim demands sacrifice. Navigation through this hierarchy requires abandoning any expectation of justice, logic, or consistency while maintaining the performance of grateful participation in a system designed to destroy human dignity in service of one man's megalomaniacal entertainment needs. As darkness falls over Caligula's Rome, The city transforms into a nightmare landscape where the emperor's paranoia reaches its most lethal intensity, and the thin veneer of daylight civilization gives way to predatory madness conducted under cover of darkness. The nights have become hunting seasons for imperial agents, informants, and the emperor himself, who often conducts his most creative tortures and executions during the hours when screams can be muffled by distance and witnesses can be eliminated more easily. The imperial curfew regulations require all citizens to be indoors by sunset unless they possess special movement permits issued by the Nocturnal Activity Authorization Office. These permits are granted sparingly and often serve as traps. Mixed citizens who apply for night movement permission automatically become subjects of investigation for suspicious activity that might require darkness to conceal. However, being caught outside without proper documentation results in immediate arrest for violations of imperial security protocols. Your cramped apartment becomes a prison cell once darkness falls, with thin walls that amplify every sound of imperial enforcement activities throughout the neighborhood. Tonight, you can hear the systematic door-to-door searches being conducted by Marcus Nocturnalis and his team of imperial night inspectors who perform random household examinations designed to catch citizens in violations of domestic loyalty requirements. The searches involve detailed inventory of personal possessions, examination of sleeping arrangements for evidence of unauthorized gatherings, and interrogation of household members about their evening activities. Sleep itself has become a political act requiring careful performance of imperial dream compliance. Citizens must maintain proper sleeping positions that demonstrate submission to imperial authority even during unconsciousness. Sleeping too soundly suggests dangerous unconsciousness of imperial oversight. Sleeping restlessly implies guilty anxiety about unreported seditious activities. The optimal sleep pattern requires light dozing that allows for immediate responsiveness to imperial night inspections while avoiding any behavior that might suggest deliberate sleep avoidance. The emperor's own nocturnal activities create city-wide terror as Caligula often emerges from his palace during midnight hours to conduct impromptu inspections of citizen loyalty. His night processions, accompanied by torch-bearing Praetorian guards and followed by execution teams, move through residential neighborhoods where his divine presence transforms private spaces into imperial judgment chambers. Citizens caught sleeping during imperial visits face charges of disrespect for divine proximity, while those found awake face suspicion of advance warning about imperial activities. Fire hazards multiply dramatically after dark as the emperor has banned most forms of artificial lighting to prevent citizens from conducting unauthorized nighttime activities. The few permitted oil lamps must burn imperial-approved oil that produces minimal light while generating maximum smoke, creating an atmosphere that obscures surveillance while simultaneously making every flame a potential catastrophe. Buildings regularly burn down during the night, with survivors facing investigation for possible arson designed to destroy evidence of seditious activities. The sounds of nighttime Rome create a symphony of terror that makes rest impossible. Distant screams echo from imperial interrogation chambers. The rhythmic marching of patrol units punctuates the darkness. Occasional trumpet blasts announce midnight executions conducted in public squares. Even the silence between sounds becomes threatening, as prolonged quiet might indicate the approach of stealth enforcement teams designed to catch citizens in unguarded moments. Criminal activity operates under imperial supervision as common thieves, murderers, and rapists have been recruited as informal imperial agents who report unusual citizen behavior while conducting their predatory activities. Victims of nighttime crimes face investigation for the suspicious circumstances that attracted criminal attention. Reporting crimes to authorities requires explaining why you were vulnerable to attack, what you might have done to provoke criminal interest, and how your victimization serves imperial educational purposes about the consequences of insufficient self-protection through loyalty demonstration. The psychological torture of imperial knights extends beyond physical dangers to create mental breakdown through sleep deprivation, constant fear, and the impossibility of genuine rest in an environment where unconsciousness might mean death and consciousness might mean discovery of violations you never knew you committed. You have survived exactly 24 hours in Caligula's Rome, though survival is perhaps too generous a term for what you've endured. You have not lived, you have merely persisted through a gauntlet of terror where every breath was monitored, every gesture scrutinized, and every thought potentially treasonous. You have existed in a state of perpetual performance where humanity itself became a luxury too dangerous to afford under the reign of an emperor who transformed paranoia into policy and madness into law. The truth that becomes inescapable after experiencing life under Caligula is that you wouldn't have lasted another day. The psychological strain alone would have broken you. The constant vigilance required to navigate impossibly contradictory rules, the mental exhaustion of performing loyalty while suppressing every natural human reaction, the spiritual destruction of worshipping obvious insanity while pretending it represents divine wisdom. Modern humans, accustomed to basic privacy, personal autonomy, and logical consistency, would crumble within hours under such systematic assault on human dignity. But the most disturbing realization is not your inability to survive Caligula's Rome, it's understanding how such a system could exist at all. This wasn't merely the aberrant behavior of one mad emperor operating in isolation. This was an entire civilization that had developed the infrastructure of tyranny so thoroughly that one man's psychosis could hijack the machinery of state and turn it against millions of people with terrifying efficiency. The informants, the bureaucrats, the enforcers, the collaborators, they were all ordinary Romans who adapted to extraordinary circumstances by abandoning their humanity in exchange for survival. Caligula's reign represents the logical extreme of absolute power, where the absence of meaningful constraints on authority creates conditions that inevitably attract and corrupt individuals who should never be trusted with power over others. The emperor's transformation from popular young ruler to paranoid tyrant illustrates how quickly political systems can collapse when institutional safeguards fail to contain megalomaniacal ambition. The Roman Empire's strength, its centralized authority and efficient administration became its greatest vulnerability when that authority fell into the hands of someone who viewed human beings as entertainment props. The Romans who lived through Caligula's reign and somehow survived did so by developing psychological defense mechanisms that allowed them to compartmentalize their humanity while performing the roles required for survival. They learned to separate their authentic selves from their public personas so completely that they could participate in atrocities while maintaining some internal core of human identity. This psychological splitting represents both remarkable human adaptability and profound spiritual damage that would echo through generations. Yet history also shows us that even Caligula's reign eventually ended. The Praetorian Guard, finally recognizing that their own survival required action, assassinated the emperor in 41 CE after less than 4 years of terror. The conspiracy succeeded not because the plotters were heroes, but because they were pragmatists who understood that Caligula's madness had become a threat to the stability that allowed them to maintain their own power and privileges. The assassination of Caligula demonstrates both the fragility and resilience of human civilization. Tyranny, no matter how absolute it appears, ultimately depends on the cooperation of those who implement its policies. When that cooperation collapses, whether through moral awakening or simple self-interest, even the most powerful dictator becomes vulnerable. The challenge lies in recognizing that moment and finding the courage to act before the system destroys everyone within it. Your day in Caligula's Rome serves as a reminder that human freedom and dignity are not natural states but achievements that require constant vigilance to preserve. The distance between civilization and barbarism is measured not in centuries but in the choices ordinary people make when faced with extraordinary pressure to abandon their principles in exchange for safety, comfort, or simply the promise of seeing another sunrise. Still awake? If you found yourself drawn into tonight's mysteries, we've got more secrets waiting in the shadows. Just click to uncover what lies ahead. And hey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so these late night revelations find their way to you whenever we unveil the next chapter